have left indelible impression on the region and on the world. Cyrus the Great established the empire, and even today, Cyrus is central to the history of Iran. The next emperor, Darius, expanded this empire, and it was then the largest empire the world had known. And it included land from Greece all the way up to River Indus. The end to the Achaemenid Empire came in the 4th century BC at the hands of Alexander of Macedonia. Alexander marched across the empire to the city of Persepolis, which is the iconic capital of Persia. About 100 years earlier, during the Greco-Persian Wars, the Persians had destroyed the Acropolis, which is in Athens, Greece, and Alexander wanted to exact revenge for the destruction of the sacred Greek icon. This is what Persepolis looked like when Alexander marched into the city. In a senseless act, Alexander, once a student of Aristotle, burnt down the city and took the loot away to finance his other wars. This is what remains of Persepolis today, and this is the city near the city of Shiraz. Thus began the conquests of General Alexander, which took him to Uzbekistan in pursuit of the last Achaemenid emperor who was killed. Alexander then surprisingly declared himself to be the Achaemenid emperor and calls himself the last Achaemenid emperor. Alexander is called great, but only in the West. In the East, he is reviled as a devil incarnate who brought nothing but death and destruction wherever he went. So we shouldn't call him Alexander the Great, just Alexander from Macedonia. Now, to give you a perspective of the period of the first Persian Empire in the 6th century, this was the period of turning point in the history of the world. Babylon was the greatest city in the world. Rome was no longer a kingdom, but it was a republic. It would later become an empire in the future. The Babylonians destroyed the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and the first exodus of the Israelites happened. Judaism, the religion as we know, was defined while the Jews or the Israelites were in Exodus. 3 religions dominated the world in that period. Buddha was preaching his message of enlightenment across India. And further east, the great teacher Confucius was spreading his wisdom across China. In Uzbekistan, Prophet Zoroaster was born near the city of Khiva. He would preach the message of Ahura Mazda, the one God. And that makes the religion as the oldest monotheistic religion in the world. The followers of this faith in Pakistan and India are called Parsis because they are from Pars, which was the name of Persia at one time. For 13 centuries, the Mazdian belief was the official religion of Persia and remained so until the 8th century when the Muslims occupied Persia. What you see here is the oldest fire temple in the world. This is in the city of Yazd in Iran. There are no fire temples today in Uzbekistan, but in the desert region there are still a few towers of silence. Zoroastrians believe that burying the dead in earth contaminates the earth, so they preferred to expose the dead to the elements and to the birds in these structures which are called the towers of silence. Before Islam arrived in Uzbekistan in the 8th century, Greater Persia was governed by 2 important dynasties. The first we already alluded to was the Achaemenid dynasty, and after that there were many small dynasties until came the Sassanids. The Sassanids would be the last pre-Islamic dynasty of Persia, and they ruled not for 100 years or two, they ruled for 400 years. And this period of the Sassanid Empire was also the most illustrious period in the region's history. And it is called the Renaissance period of Central Asia and of entire Persia. All the domes you see, the miniatures you see, and the fine carpet designs, which we all say are Islamic designs, are actually from pre-Islamic area and specifically from the Sassanid period. At the time of our Prophet, peace be on him, the Arabs faced two mighty adversaries in the north: the Roman Byzantiums on the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire on the east. The Roman capital was Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul, and the eastern capital was called Ctesiphon, and that is in today's Iraq. These two empires were not countries, but they were full-fledged empires, and for decades they had been fighting with each other, and after so many wars they were left weak and vulnerable, and the Muslim Arabs in the south were waiting for an opportunity to extend their influence in this region. And that happened just after the passing away of our Prophet in 632. Just 2 years after the Prophet's demise, under Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiq, the legendary Arab general Khalid bin Walid won the critical war with the Romans in the city of Yarmouk and occupied Damascus, which was then an important Roman city. 2 years later, under Hazrat Umar, General Saad bin Waqqas defeated the Sassanians at the city of Qadisiyah, and Qadisiyah was near the city of Kufa, which is now in Iraq. And this victory was nothing short of a miracle. Around 10,000 very ill-equipped and inexperienced Arabs, and they were on camelbacks and with bare feet, were fighting the Romans, by fighting in the empire, Sassanid Empire, and which after fighting the Romans was battle-hardy, and they came on fleet horses and war elephants. It was really a contest between David and Goliath, and the battle lasted just 5 days. The Persian commander Rustam was killed, and the jubilant Arabs laid claim to entire Persia, which also included Central Asia. Islam did not spread to Central Asia quickly, but it would take about 50 more years before it would travel up north. And Arabs after Qadisiyah reached Transoxania, and the first city they occupied was called Merv, which is Mary right here, and this is a city in Turkmenistan. After that, they advanced to Samarkand, to Tashkent, to Bukhara, and to Fargana Valley. The Arab invasion would forever change the canvas of the region. Two great institutions of Central Asia before Islam arrived were monarchy and the religion of Zoroastrianism. Both were swept away by Islam, and they brought with them a new religion, a new language, and with it a new script. In the early 8th century, the Umayyad Khalifa was Al-Walid, and he will be long remembered for making the Masjid-e-Aqsa in Jerusalem and the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. Khalifa Walid appointed a very devout general by the name of Qutaybiyyah ibn Muslim as the viceroy of this region of Khorasan. The viceroy claimed a jihad against the Zoroastrians, the Christians, and the Buddhists who lived in the region of Central Asia. During the next 10 years, the general destroyed the temples and ordered mosques like this one to be built on the ruins. He encouraged people to come for the Salat, and he would always give them a reward for coming to the Friday prayers. Under Umayyad Khalifa al-Walid, Muslim armies were not just expanding in Central Asia, but in Europe, in Spain, they were advancing towards the Pyrenees Mountains in France, and in India, they were occupying. Muhammad bin Qasim defeated Raja Dahir to occupy Sindh. So under Khalifa al-Walid, Islamic troops were advancing almost all over this region. The Arab conquests of Central Asia brought not just Islam to the region, but the flowering of the Islamic thought, Islamic philosophy, Sufism, and all this would turn Bukhara into a sacred city of religiosity and learning. Imam Bukhari, who in the 9th century collated the hadith called Sahih Bukhari, this hadith is considered only second to the Quran in its religiosity. This is the temple, this is the mausoleum of Imam Bukhari, and this is another view. Bukhara is also the birthplace of a Sufi scholar, and his name was Bahauddin Naqshbandi. His mausoleum is surrounded by beautiful gardens, grape trellises and apple trees, and people from around Bukhara come to this place in traditional finery to offer Fatiha and pray and spend some peaceful moments in the gardens. During the times of Imam Bukhari, several minor kingdoms had sprung up in Central Asia. But they were all Arabs, and they paid tribute to the Abbasid Khalif in Baghdad. But there was one kingdom which was clearly distinct from the others, and this was called the Samanids. Now here, please don't confuse the Samanids with the Sassanids. Sassanids were the pre-Islamic, non-Muslim dynasty, and the Samanids were very much Muslims. The Samanids were resentful of the growing influence of the Arabs in the region, and they wanted to preserve the Iranian ethos and the culture. So they declared independence from the Abbasid Khalif in Baghdad, and they made Bukhara the capital. The ruler was Ismail bin Samani, and here we are admiring his mausoleum in the city of Bukhara. The Samanids promoted Persian language and culture, but accepted the language of Arabic and the Arabic script only for science and theology. It was during the Samanid period that the art and the science of the Muslims prospered, and Bukhara competed with Baghdad for sponsorship of scholars and savants. Uzbekistan can claim several scholars of the Muslim world, and among them the most illustrious is Abu Ali Sina. The English call them Avicenna. He was born in the city of Afshana, which is just outside the city of Samarkand, Bukhara, and he was not just a renowned physician, but he was also an astronomer and a philosopher. Two of his books have become very famous, and one is on medicine, and strangely it is called Qanun. His other book on philosophy is strangely called the book Kitab al-Shifa. A bit strange, but that's it. Avicenna was influenced by contemporary scientists. Uzbek he was, Al-Biruni. In fact, the city on the Amudarya is named after him, in the city of Birun. Another great scholar from Uzbekistan was Al-Khwarazmi, the father of algebra. A huge statue to him stands just outside the city of Urgench, and this is near Khiva. Umar Khayyam. Umar Khayyam, a poet, a mathematician, and astronomer, was born in Nishapur, which is near Mashhad today, but he lived most of his life in Samarkand in Central Asia. All of you are familiar with his Rubaiyat and the English translations by Fitzgerald. And in my opinion, Edward Fitzgerald in the 19th century was not quite fair to the translation of Umar Khayyam. He has reduced his work to the poetry of song, dance, and women, but he was more than that. He was a philosopher, and he calculated the length of the year in that period, and that was in this 11th century. And even today, his calculations are off only by about a few seconds. Most of the scientists and the scholars in the region wrote in Arabic. So most of us perceive them to be Arab scholars. But the fact was that most of them were from Central Asia, and they were Persians. One poet, Abul Qasim Firdausi, broke from the tradition and refused to use even a single word of Arabic in his magnum opus, which was called the Shahnameh. The Shahnameh is the longest epic poem ever created by man, and it is eulogy to the pre-Islamic kings, not the Islamic kings, but the pre-Islamic kings and their religion, which was the Zoroastrian faith. It is quite simply a Persian masterpiece, and even longer than the Iliad written by Homer. In Shahnameh, Firdausi doesn't grudge Islam, but he does lament the coming of the Arabs to Persia. And if Shahnameh, it is said it was not written, then the history of pre-Islam of Persia would have remained in oblivion. The Shahnameh, as was the tradition on those days, sponsored by the ruler, and this time it was Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, which is today in Afghanistan. So Mahmud Ghaznavi sponsored the work of Firdausi, and Firdausi took about 30 years to write the Shahnameh. And after completing it, he proudly presented his work to the Sultan, and he was not happy. He looked at it and he complained that this is eulogy only for the pre-Islamic area, only for the non-Muslims. So he dismissed him with a few coins instead of giving him the gold coins he had promised for every verse he had written. Of course, Firdausi was very disappointed. He took the coins, and on the way he gave half of them to the wine seller, and the other half he gave to the bath attendant. So he came back home, but a few months later the Sultan realized the beauty of the poems, the wordings, the knowledge he had written in it, and the time it took for Firdausi to complete the work. So he sent him a camel loads of gifts to Firdausi. He was very contrite and he wanted to make amends for that. But when the camels were coming in from one city gate, the funeral of Firdausi was leaving through the other. The gifts were delivered to his wife, rather as to his daughter, who did not accept them and returned all the gifts to the Sultan. In the wake of the die-hard Samanids, Central Asia was invaded in the 11th century by a Turkic tribe which was called the Seljuks. And they descended from the pasture land around the lakes of Aral and the Caspian. And the Seljuks had no religion of their own or any literary traditions. They adapted to Sunni Islam as the faith, and they took over Persian language as the language of expression. The Seljuks marched through Uzbekistan and then into Persia, and finally they settled in Anatolia province, which is today in Turkey. You will be interested to know that the present Ottomans are all descendants of the Seljuks. And those who are watching this series, Ertugrul and the Ertugrul Resurrection, you are quite familiar with the entire history of the Seljuks in that region. The Seljuks, who were sponsors of art and were great scholars themselves, left no imprint on Transoxania. But in the capital city of Isfahan, they built this magnificent Jamia Mosque. The Seljuk architecture is characterized by the use of stone, even in its calligraphy. About 200 years after Seljuks, in the 13th century, a vast area in the western Uzbekistan, which is right here, was under the power of a very arrogant and a despotic sultan by the name of Muhammad, Sultan Muhammad. And he ruled from the city of Khiva, which is right here. And his empire was called the Khwarazm Empire. In the year 1219, a letter arrived from the east addressed to this sultan. And this letter changed the destiny of not just Central Asia, but of the entire civilization of that region. It was a letter from the mighty Mongol warrior Chengiz Khan. Chengiz Khan, whose original name was Temujin, was born in Outer Mongolia. He grew up among the barbarians and the warlords, and he was not a Muslim but a follower of shamanism, which is a belief in souls and sorcery and magic. On the battlefield, he was merciless and he was cruel. His winning tactic was to first terrorize the city and then destroy every living thing in the city, so that when he challenged the next city, they would surrender to him without a fight. And he spared neither man nor beast. You can see in the map that the Mongol Empire was the largest empire in human history. Europe all the way up to Korea and right here. Chengiz Khan sent the letter with a delegation which specifically included Muslims, because this letter was going to a Muslim sultan. They took many camel loads of gifts, including silk and jade, and the message he sent was very short and very simple. The Khan said that I have occupied every land I have coveted. I live in peace now, and I want to do trade with you, because I hear the Muslims have much to offer me, and I want to trade with you and do not wish war with you. The arrogant Khwarazm Sultan scoffed at the idea of dealing with a Mongol barbarian. He confiscated all his gifts, killed the messengers, and one of the messengers, he shaved his head, tarred his face black, and sent him back to Chengiz Khan to tell the story. Nobody, but nobody, can trifle with Chengiz Khan. In anger and in humiliation, Chengiz Khan withdrew to his very special prayer mountain for inspiration. He descended 3 days later and announced revenge. Revenge for insulting him, revenge for insulting his messengers, and for killing his messengers. And for the next 4 years, he laid the land waste. Transoxania was reduced to rubble. He destroyed one city after another as though he was swatting flies. On this expedition, particularly, the Mongol juggernaut was being led personally by Chengiz Khan. He normally didn't go for the wars leading it, but this time he decided that he will lead this expedition. And he attacked not just an empire, but an entire civilization. Any city in his way was razed and put to torch. Bukhara, Khiva, Urgench, Merv, Herat, all were scorched to rubble. And when he finally caught up with the Sultan who had insulted him, he had molten silver poured down his throat. In Bukhara, Chengiz Khan stopped at this mosque, which was built by General Khutebia in the 9th century. He was very impressed by the tower and the tall minar. He hadn't seen a taller minar, so he climbed it. And looking down at the people who were worshipping, he shouted, "I am the curse of God on you for the evil you have done in this world." And then he ordered the destruction of the mosque, but preserved the tower. This is the rebuilt mosque and tower. It is called the Kalon Mosque and Tower in the city of Bukhara. In fact, the entire city is now rebuilt. Very popular with the tourists. Mosques today are full in the Jummah prayers in Bukhara. This is a functioning madrasa and the bazaar of many domes. Genghis Khan destroyed all things beautiful and left behind nothing but bad memories. Throughout Uzbekistan, when I traveled, I could not find even a single remnant from that period, not even the rubble from the days of the great Khan. On his death, Genghis Khan made his eldest son Chagatai the governor of Central Asia. The sons of the great Khan are not well known, but his two grandsons are, and they had great impact on history. Kublai Khan invaded the Great Wall of China and set up the Yuan Kingdom, which was the first non-Chinese kingdom of the region. The other was Halagu Khan. He would sack the city of Baghdad and the libraries and bring the curtain down on the golden age of Islam in the year 1258. Within 100 years after Genghis Khan, Central Asia was see the rise of another ferocious power from the city of Scheherazade just outside Samarkand. He was Temur. We call him Temur Lang, but he is not called Temur Khan because he is not from the family of Genghis Khan. But he married a princess from the family and took very proudly the royal name called Gurijan. And he always wanted him to be called Gurijan, and that meant the royal son-in-law. In Pakistani politics, we too have a famous son-in-law, you know. Temur was an illiterate barbarian who founded an empire. And he founded the empires from Delhi to Moscow and from Kashgar to Herat. He massacred millions without mercy, but called himself the sword of Islam, the warrior of the faith. A larger-than-life statue stands at his birth city of Scheherazade. After every victory, Temur would send the best artists and craftsmen to the city of Samarkand, which he loved. In Uzbekistan, they overlook all the negative stories of Temurlen, his cruelty and all the massacres he had done. But after independence in 1991, he was celebrated as the Amir of Uzbekistan, the leader who united the Turkic family identity, and his statues are all over the city of and the country of Uzbekistan. Among the first monuments Temur built was a tribute to his Chinese wife at Bibi Khanum Mosque. He wanted to be buried in Scheherazade, his birthplace, and he even built a crypt, but that was not to be. After a war with the Chinese, when he died in the war, they couldn't bring his body because of the severe and a fierce snowstorm, and the sarcophagus he built for himself lies empty today. Temur was a warrior, but his grandson was a philosopher, and he was called Ulugh Beg. And he was not just a philosopher, but a scholar and a very renowned astronomer in the field of astronomy. Ulugh Beg decided to bury his grandfather in this mausoleum in Samarkand, a magnificent memorial befitting the eminence of the Emir. It was called Gur Amir, which means the tomb of the leader. Temur's grave is in jade right here, and he lies at the feet of his spiritual teacher by the name of Sayyid Baraka. Ulugh Beg is right next to him. In 1941, the Russians decided to open the grave of Temurlen, and when they opened, there was a message in it which said, "Whoever disturbs my tomb will encounter a ruler worse than me." And for those people who believe in revenge after death and all the occult sciences, would be perhaps not amazed to know that in 1941, just after they exhumed his body, Hitler attacked Russia. Then Stalin, who was in power at that time, after several months or next year, he reburied him within Islamic traditions. And again, do you know what happens? The city of Stalingrad was again saved by the Moscow, by Russians, and the Germans left it. So there it is, a story for those who believe in the occult. If the exterior of Gur Amir is beautiful, this is alluring, and I would say that this is the most beautiful mausoleum I have seen in my entire travels. During the Timurid period, this palace was called Registan. It was a public square, a caravanserai, and a place for royal edicts. Three imposing structures around this site are not mosques, but they are madrasas. And all the beautiful structures were made by the artisans sent back by Timur to the city of Samarkand. And if those of you who visited Iran and you find similarity between this and the Safavid period, it is only because many of the workers at this time also worked on the monuments built by the Safavid Shah Abbas. This is Registan at dusk. This is one madrasa called the Ulugh Beg Madrasa, where they taught astronomy and Islam and science together. This is another madrasa. And this is the third one, called the Tilyakari Mausoleum, named after its beautiful ceiling. The Timurid dynasty was succeeded by Zahiruddin Babur, the last of the Mongols, who was a direct descendant of Timur. He was born in Andijan in Fargana Valley, and he became the ruler at the age of 12. He led a war against Samarkand, lost it, but finally he moved to Afghanistan, and from there he marched into India, and in 1526 he defeated the Lodi dynasty and established the Mughal Empire, and this would last for about 300 years. In Fargana, we searched for any monument to Babur. In fact, they call Babur, and there was only this madrasa from his days, nothing more than that. But in the city was a grand mosque, where in the city of Andijan. This is where he was born. Babur wanted to be buried in Kabul, but unfortunately he died in Delhi, and he was transferred there, and his mausoleum is just outside the city of Kabul. Fargana is famous not just because of Babur, but it is also famous for its verdant valleys and orchards and gardens. The women in Uzbekistan are free. They can drive anything they want. Or sell fruit on the roadside. Packing grapes for the market and ready for the apples to ripe. And you see, cotton in Uzbekistan is the biggest cash crop, and there are miles and miles of cotton fields. You can photograph all of them if you want, but you're not allowed to photograph the cotton fields when they are being picked. I found that out from my guide, and he said that it is the law in Uzbekistan that all school children and college students, they have to pick cotton because this is important for them, and everybody has to do that. So the Westerners found out that it was child labor. And so the cotton trade between Uzbekistan and the West dropped. So now they make a law that you cannot photograph. I saw a lot of people picking cotton, but my guide said, please, no photography here. Strange. Now we will leave the world of Mongols and fast forward to the early 18th century. Two cities had become notorious for slave trading, and this was Bukhara and Khiva. And mind you, these were slaves, not the black African slaves, but these were white Caucasian slaves from the region, and many of them were Russian slaves. Naturally, this was a serious provocation for the Tsars in Petersburg. Unfortunately, the first Russian expedition against Khiva in Central Asia to free the Russian slaves was a disaster. The envoy of Peter the Great, along with the entire expeditionary force, was totally slaughtered and annihilated by the Khan of Khiva. Russian army was heavily deployed elsewhere and was not ready to retaliate. But one day they would, and avenge the defeat. But that day would come about 150 years later, not now. This is Khiva today. Khan, this is called the Ichan Qila, is a massive fortification from the days of the Khan of Khiva. The main darwaza of Ichan Qila. And within the Qila is the inner citadel of Khiva called the Kunya Ark. The main street, the Juma Mosque, also called the Cathedral Mosque. It was built in the 18th century, but some of the columns are here from the 10th century. The tomb of Pelwan Mahmud, the patron saint of the city of Khiva. We're enjoying a traditional Uzbek meal, and there is music in the air in the city, and there is spontaneous dancing all around. The Khan of Khiva was a harsh ruler. He hated the Russians and all foreigners. He kept Russian slaves in dungeons for decades, and the lucky ones got away or got sold. The others perished here. But things were not much different in the city of Bukhara, which, like Khiva, was a major slave trading station. In the early 18th century, Bukhara was ruled by a particularly vicious emir called Nasrullah. Amir Nasrullah Bahadur Khan, very vicious, very difficult person. In the rule of Amir Nasrullah, there were frequent public hangings and beheadings of bandits, of petty thieves and such likes in front of this citadel ark. But on June 14, 1842, a very large number of the citizens had gathered here to witness an unusual execution. The two prisoners who were being beheaded were not common prisoners or criminals, but were serving British officers 4,000 miles away. The accusation? Spying for British India. Fact? Colonel Stoddart and Captain Arthur Connolly were not spies. They were sent by British India to Bukhara to negotiate with the Amir and convince him not to pick up a fight with the Russians who were advancing towards Bukhara, and the Indians were fearful that they would eventually march into India, British India. This is the Citadel Ark today, a very popular tourist attraction, largely because of the beheadings here of Stoddart and Connolly. The photographs are prominently displayed in the museum of the Ark. And Amir Nasrullah kept all prisoners in a citadel prison. It was called a Zindan. Prisoners convicted of minor offenses were kept in cages, like this one is called the Karasdar cell, for people who was Karasdar and they were kept here. But Stoddart and Connolly were consigned to a vermin pit. It's called the bug pit, and which was regularly replenished with rodents, scorpions and fire ants. The Englishmen were finally brought out, and Connolly was cruelly executed, and forcibly his partner was asked to witness the execution. The partner was then returned to the pit and brought out again the next day so that a larger crowd would come and witness the execution. By the middle of 19th century, one by one, the cities of Central Asia fell to the advancing Tsarist Cossacks. Tashkent fell first, then Samarkand, then Bukhara, and finally Khiva. The Russians had finally avenged the defeat, albeit a century late. Uzbekistan was now occupied completely by Russia. With the conquest of each Central Asian state, London felt that the Russians were planning to enter British India. The British, who had come to India by ship, had no idea about the mountains in the north or the passes in the north, and they were suspecting that the Russians would finally come in from that region. They thought their designs on India. Russians denied it, but the Indians didn't believe it. For nearly a century, the two most powerful nations on earth, Victorian England and Imperial Russia, fought a secret war on the deserts and lonely passes of Central Asia, and this war, Rudyard Kipling called it as the Great Game. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia was separated from British India by 2,000 kilometers. But by the end of the 19th century, only a 20-mile Wakhan border separated Russians from British India. So it became strategically important for the British to explore the northern regions to see where the Russians might be coming in from. So the region was infested by the Russian agents, so the British sent their agents camouflaged as fakirs or as sadhus. And they all walked with measured steps, and they had a tasbih in their hand to measure the distance, and they hid a sextant under the cloak, and they sent important strategic information to the government in Calcutta. The only thing which betrayed the personality were the sturdy shoes. The sadhus would not wear shoes like this, only the climbers would. The Great Game simmered for decades, and in 1979, the Russians did what the British had feared over a century. They marched into the region, but not through the mountains, but across the plains of Afghanistan. And the first Russian tanks crossed the Amu Darya into Afghanistan was ironically just a few kilometers away from the graves of the Great Game heroes who were buried right in this region. In the early 20th century, the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin ended the Tsar dynasty. Many Central Asian Muslims joined the army hoping that they would get a better deal under the Russian Red Army, but they were terribly disappointed. Before the revolution, Central Asia script was Arabic, Latin script was introduced forcibly, and later the Russian script, the Cyrillic, was enforced on the Central Asians so that they could communicate with the other Russians. Under Stalin in 1924, the Russian Slavs broke the Turkic states into 5 separate republics, which today form the Central Asian countries. All were predominantly Muslims, and so the atrocities against them continued. Before the Russian Revolution, there were some 2,600 mosques in the region, and in 1985 there were only 400 active mosques, and tens of thousands of Central Asians, including scholars, were deported from this region to Siberia. Under Khrushchev, in 1955, attacks against Islam in Central Asia intensified. Soviet Union was the union of the godless. Islamic scholars were arrested, Islamic weddings were banned, Islamic burials were prohibited, and all over Central Asia, women were banned from wearing the veil. In 1959 in Bukhara, a ceremony marked the last veil to be burned in Bukhara in Central Asia. President Gorbachev decided in late 1980s to open his country to transparency and restructuring, glasnost and perestroika. Under his watch, Soviet Union unraveled. On December 8, 1991, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the original signatories to the USSR Constitution, met in the city of Minsk, and after agreeing that the Muslim Central Asia was holding the progress of the Russians back, they decided to separate the Central Asian states from Russia. Even authors like Solzhenitsyn pleaded with the Russians to get rid of the Muslims of Central Asia. Few nations of the world have ever been forced to become independent. And that is what happened to these Central Asian states. Without a drop of blood, without a single martyr, Central Asian states were cut loose and asked to go their way. Gorbachev became a darling in the West and was given a Nobel Prize, but the Russians see him as the worst leader of the 20th century. After independence, there was no upsurge of Islamic fundamentalism in Uzbekistan. In fact, there was Islamic revivalism. The constitution of Uzbekistan was changed, and Article 60 makes Uzbekistan a secular country. Muslims are mostly Sunnis there, the 90%. 10% are Russians, Orthodox, and a smattering of Jews and the Zoroastrians. This is a functioning madrasa in Tashkent today. Students study science and theology, but in mid-90s, Saudi Arabia tried to introduce Wahhabism here, and in 1922, some fundamentalists occupied a government building demanding Sharia in Uzbekistan. President Karimov came down very hard on the rebels who fled to Afghanistan and to Pakistan. The Central Asians were not prepared for this sudden freedom, but they have come a long way from the gloom and despair. This is modern Uzbekistan, which owes much of its progress and infrastructure to the Russian days. This is the entrance to the subway. This is the Tashkent railway station. Bullet trains with Wi-Fi on board connect major cities of Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan has been at the crossroads of history for over 3,000 years. It has witnessed diverse cultures, languages, and religions. It was here that the oldest religion in the world was born, and it was from here that Islam spread to Central Asia. All its cities were squashed by the Mongols, but like the phoenix, it rose from the ashes and produced scholars and intellectuals who enriched the golden period of Islam. Uzbekistan is a resilient nation which, despite its tragic past, has preserved its culture and its religious identity. Thank you for your attention. Yes. You have any question?
Sir.
Yes, please.
Sir, thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation on Uzbekistan. I am Ajaz. Thank you very much, sir, for a very comprehensive presentation. And it is so comprehensive that there is no requirement left to visit Uzbekistan. Sir, I was just wondering, what is the cost of traveling in Uzbekistan? Is it expensive? And do we have Airbnb and couch surfing as we have in Europe and Africa?
It's very easy to travel. There's a direct flight from this city to Tashkent.
Within Uzbekistan?
1.5 hours. Within Uzbekistan is very easy. They are very cooperative and good people. And I really enjoyed that.
Cost of traveling?
Not at all expensive. Not at all expensive, you know, and nothing like European travel.
Food?
Food is delicious.
Expensive, cheap?
I would think as a student also you'll find it quite affordable, you know.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. There's one question here, please.
When I visited the tomb of Taimur, the guide said, now I don't know if this is fake news or if it's true, that the slab that covers his grave was stolen by Nadir Shah. And he was taking it away and it cracked, which is why there is the crack in it, which you must have seen. And he got scared, occult, vagara, vagara, and so he returned it. Now, is that true, or did he make that story up?
I did not hear that. And if I did, I would have looked at his tomb a bit more closely for the crack. I must have missed it.
So I was just wondering.
You could very well be right. lot of stories are, there, but some are authentic, some need to be taken with a grain of salt. Jab, another question there.
Since I'm here, I might as well ask this question since I'm here. Is the Oxus the Amudarya or the Sirdarya?
So, sorry, I didn't get that. Oxus?
The Oxus.
Yeah, Oxus.
Is it the Amudarya or the Sirdarya?
Sirdarya is called Jakhartis. Okay. Amudarya is called Oxus.
The Oxus.
And both are Latin names for the two rivers here.
Thank you very much.